Welcome to The Curious Machine. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something really fascinating and honestly quite perplexing. We're exploring how people react under extreme pressure, specifically when held captive. We're talking about these unexpected bonds that can form in terrifying situations, the kind that seem to defy common sense. And to really get into it, let's go back to Sweden, 1973. Imagine this. A bank robbery is underway. A guy named Eric Johnson, armed, storms into a city bank, fires his gun, shouts, "Party's starting." Huh. Just chaos, right?
Yeah.
You'd expect sheer panic, terror, maybe hostages trying to fight back or escape. But what actually unfolded was, well, not what you'd think. How do you think people would react in that kind of situation?
He was definitely chaotic. Eric Johnson took 4 bank employees hostage pretty quickly, and the police, they were there almost instantly surrounding the place. It turned into a very tense standoff. Johnson had some specific demands. A lot of money, yes, ammunition. But also, and this was the surprising part, he wanted his friend, Clark Olofsson, released from prison and brought to the bank, plus a getaway car.
And the police actually agreed to some of that.
They did, partially. They brought Olofsson, provided the money and the car, but they kept the siege going.
And this wasn't over quickly, right? How long did it last?
It stretched on for 6 full days.
6 days inside a bank with armed robbers. Wow.
And during those 6 days, things got incredibly tense. At one point, Johnson tied a rope around the neck of one hostage, Emily Davis, and basically hung her from the ceiling. Her feet were just barely touching the floor.
That's horrific.
It was. And when the police thought about using gas to end it, the captors warned them. They pointed out that the gas would knock Emily unconscious, and because of how she was positioned, she'd suffocate.
That's chillingly calculated. It stopped the police plan.
It did. A brutal but effective manipulation.
So after 6 days of that, the police finally go in. What happens then? This is where it gets even stranger, isn't it?
It really is. When the police finally stormed the bank, the hostages, they did something shocking. They actually protected the robbers.
Protected them.
Yes. They shielded Johnson and Olofsson with their bodies, yelling at the police, "Don't shoot them."
I just can't wrap my head around that. They defended their own captors. After everything, what happened after the arrests?
Well, the baffling behavior continued. Emily Davis, the one hung from the ceiling, later admitted she'd had chances to escape during those 6 days.
But she didn't take them.
She chose not to. And after Johnson and Olofsson were caught, none of the former hostages would testify against them.
Seriously?
Instead, they actually pooled their own money to help pay for the robbers' legal defense.
No way.
And they visited them in prison regularly. Years later, Emily Davis said something quite revealing. Quote, "The robber said he would only shoot me in the leg, not kill me." I thought, what a kind and thoughtful person.
Kind and thoughtful about someone threatening to shoot her, it sounds like. I don't know, a coping mechanism pushed to the absolute extreme. What does it mean when victims feel gratitude for their captors?
That exact question, that profound, confusing reaction, is what led Dr. Nils Johnson, a criminologist and psychiatrist involved in the case, to coin the term Stockholm Syndrome. It's named after the city where the robbery happened, obviously. The term became really popular. You hear it a lot. But it's important to be clear. Stockholm Syndrome isn't actually an official psychiatric diagnosis. You won't find it in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. So more of a description.
Kind of. Its symptoms often overlap with things that are recognized, like trauma bonding, that intense connection between an abuser and victim in a cycle of abuse and kindness, or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay, that distinction is key. So this kind of bonding, this adaptation, does it only happen in these dramatic public hostage situations, or do we see it elsewhere?
Absolutely elsewhere. It's not just bank robberies. Take the case of Natalie Kingston. She was 18 from Vienna, abducted by a man named Victor Miller. She was held captive for 8 years.
8 years? That's almost unimaginable. What was her captivity like?
It started grimly, confined to a small, windowless cell. But over time, Miller gave her more freedom within the house. She ended up doing chores, cooking, cleaning. Eventually, she was allowed in the garden, even met some of Miller's friends.
But this was still captivity, right? Under his control.
Completely. And accompanied by severe abuse, starvation, physical violence, threats, rape. Yet, paradoxically, she apparently had opportunities to escape during those 8 years.
But she didn't try.
She didn't. Not until the very end.
And what happened when she finally did escape? What was her reaction?
After 8 years, she managed to get away. When Victor Miller found out she'd escaped, he committed suicide.
And Natalie, how did she take that news?
This is what's so striking. She was reportedly devastated. People around her really struggled to comfort her.
Devastated by the death of her abuser and captor.
Yes. And years later, she gave an interview offering this perspective. She said, "Yes, I lived a very different life, but in some ways it benefited me. For example, I never started smoking or drinking. I never had bad friends."
Benefited her. She rationalized it that way.
It seems so. Even more astonishingly, after her ordeal ended, she voluntarily moved back into the house where she'd been held,
She moved back in.
and she kept a photograph of Victor Miller.
Wow. That level of psychological shift it's hard to comprehend. It's like the mind twists reality to survive. Is that kind of what psychologists think is happening? How can someone feel positive or even loyal towards someone who caused them so much harm?
Well, one way experts try to understand this is through an evolutionary lens. These seemingly irrational attachments might actually be an extreme survival mechanism kicking in under immense inescapable threat.
A survival mechanism like fight or flight.
Sort of, but more like an extreme version of the freeze response. Think about it in the animal kingdom sometimes. You see cases where, say, a dominant monkey attacks a weaker one, and the weaker monkey then tries to stay close to the aggressor, almost seeking refuge with the source of the threat. Or think about a dog submitting to a stronger dog rolling over, acting like a puppy. It's signaling, "I'm not a threat," trying to appease the aggressor to survive. In humans, under overwhelming trauma, where fight or flight aren't options, the mind might freeze normal emotional responses. Rationalizing the situation, even seeing the captor in a positive light, becomes a way to cope, to reduce the terror, to mentally survive minute by minute.
So it's like adapting by mentally aligning with the threat to make it seem less threatening.
In a way, yes. It's a desperate unconscious strategy to find some sliver of safety or control in a situation where you have none. You try to appease, to bond, because resistance seems futile or even more dangerous.
That makes a disturbing kind of sense. You can almost see echoes in society sometimes, maybe with oppressed groups occasionally adopting behaviors of the powerful as a way to navigate rather than directly confront.
That's a complex parallel, but yes, the core idea of adapting survival strategies in the face of overwhelming power has resonance. And this reframing of reality, it appears in other contexts too. Take the 2002 Capitol Theater siege in Moscow.
Oh, I remember that. Eastern European militants took a whole theater hostage. A terrible outcome, wasn't it?
Truly tragic. 130 hostages died, along with all the attackers. But what's relevant here is how some survivors later described it. In interviews, some didn't frame it as a terrifying terrorist attack. They perceived it almost as an artistic performance.
An artistic performance. The siege.
It sounds bizarre, but it shows how profoundly the mind can reframe reality under extreme stress, perhaps to distance itself from the horror to make it somehow bearable. And think about how far this transformation can go. There's the really disturbing case of Patricia Hill, daughter of a wealthy family kidnapped in 1974 by a group called the Freedom Liberation Front.
What happened to her?
She was kept in horrific conditions, a tiny, dark closet, abused, repeatedly raped, just brutal.
Awful. But her story didn't end with the rescue, did it?
No, that's the shocking part. About a year after she was rescued, Patricia Hill was arrested.
Arrested for what?
For robbing a bank in San Francisco. She was carrying a rifle. She changed her name to Tanya and had become an active armed member of the same group that had kidnapped and abused her.
She joined them after what they did to her.
She did. From victim to militant accomplice. It's perhaps one of the most extreme examples of this kind of psychological transformation.
The depth of that change is just staggering. It really makes you question everything about identity and survival.
It does. And it's interesting, while we focus on the hostage bonding with the captor, there are related, almost opposite phenomena, too.
What?
Well, there's something called Lima syndrome. That's where the captors start to develop sympathy or empathy for their hostages.
The captors feel for the hostages.
Exactly. A key example was the Japanese embassy hostage crisis in Lima, Peru, back in 1996. The militants ended up releasing many hostages early, apparently because they developed empathy for them.
Huh. So the dynamic can flip completely.
It can. And then there's also London syndrome. This is where hostages might become defiant, argumentative, or uncooperative, actually provoking their captors.
And that's dangerous, I assume.
Extremely. The name comes from the 1980 Iranian embassy siege in London. One hostage consistently argued with the terrorists, defied them, and they deliberately killed him for it. His defiance ultimately triggered the Special Forces raid.
So you have this whole spectrum: bonding, empathy from captors, defiance. It shows there's no single way people react in these nightmares.
Precisely. It highlights the sheer range of human psychological responses under unbearable pressure. If we were to try and summarize the core features people usually point to when they talk about Stockholm Syndrome, it generally includes four things. One, the hostage develops positive feelings for the captor. Two, there's no previous relationship. Three, the hostage refuses to cooperate with authorities like the police. And four, the hostage starts to see the captor's humanity, maybe even aligns with their values or goals, stops seeing them purely as a threat.
Okay, those are the classic signs people describe. But earlier you mentioned it's not an official diagnosis, and that raises a really important question. Is Stockholm Syndrome actually a real, distinct psychological condition, or is it something else? What's the critical view here?
That is the crucial debate. And there are significant criticisms of the concept. First, as we said, the lack of formal recognition in the DSM. That's mainly because there isn't a strong body of consistent, rigorous academic research defining it as a unique disorder. Many experts argue the symptoms attributed to it are better explained by existing, well-researched conditions like PTSD or trauma bonding.
Right, the overlap you mentioned.
Exactly. Another major criticism is the gap between media hype and actual evidence. It's a very famous term, captures the public imagination, features in movies. But research suggests it's actually quite rare. Remember that FBI study of over 1,200 hostage situations? They found signs in only about 8% of cases. And if you filter out those who are just hostile to law enforcement, maybe understandably so, the number drops to maybe 5%.
So very few cases actually fit the popular image.
Very few. It gets sensationalized. But maybe the most pointed criticism comes from scholars like Dr. Alan Wade or journalists like Jess Hill. They argue the whole concept of Stockholm Syndrome might be problematic, even a myth or a dubious pathology.
How so?
Their argument is that the concept might have been created or at least popularized partly as a way to discredit victims, particularly women. By focusing on the victim's supposedly irrational psychological state, it potentially shifts attention away from the perpetrator's violence and control.
So blaming the victim in a way.
Yeah.
Labeling their survival strategy as a syndrome.
That's the concern. Jess Hill specifically points out that Dr. Nils Johnson, who coined the term, made his initial diagnosis of Emily Davis from that original bank robbery without ever actually speaking to her. And significantly, his diagnosis came after she had publicly criticized the way he and the authorities handled the siege.
Wow. Okay. That context changes things. It suggests the label itself might have been influenced by factors other than pure clinical observation.
It certainly raises questions about the origin and application of the term.
So for you listening, what does this critical take mean? How should you think about these incredibly complex situations?
I think it means we need to be really critical consumers of information. Don't just accept a popular term like Stockholm Syndrome at face value. Understand its history, the criticisms, the lack of formal standing. It reminds us how narratives get built and how focusing on a victim's psychological response, however adaptive it might seem, can sometimes distract from the actions of the abuser and the systemic failures that might allow abuse to happen. It challenges us to think more deeply about victimhood, survival, and responsibility.
It absolutely does. So we started with a dramatic bank robbery and ended up questioning a widely known psychological term. It's been a real deep dive into how extreme stress can warp human behavior and perception in ways that are, well, truly baffling.
It really is.
Yeah.
And whether you call it Stockholm Syndrome, trauma bonding, or something else, the core phenomenon remains. Under immense pressure, the human mind shows incredible, sometimes disturbing, adaptability. It speaks volumes about our resilience, our vulnerability, and our profound drive to survive, even if that means bending our perception of reality itself.
It certainly forces you to reconsider what normal behavior even means when someone is pushed to the absolute limit.
Exactly. And maybe being aware of these complex psychological responses is the first step. Understanding how these survival mechanisms work, even if they seem counterintuitive, might help us better support victims and perhaps eventually find ways to mitigate these effects in extreme situations. What does this reveal to you about the true nature of human adaptation?
A powerful thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you very much for sharing this enjoyable conversation with us. Until we meet again tomorrow with a brand new topic, take very good care of yourselves. Goodbye.